Hello, everyone. We are going to just give it a few more minutes for everyone else to join, and then we will start the session. Okay, I think we could start. Yeah, perfect. So, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining. We are very excited to have you today and to host this webinar, which is actually the second in a series of events that we are hosting by a project called SOLARIS, which is an EU Horizon project, so funded by the EU. And its aim is to explore the socio-political challenges and opportunities of AI-generated media. So first of all, I'm Yasaman Yousefi. I will be the moderator of this event. I am a PhD student, and I am also one of the members of SOLARIS project. So with Solaris, we are hosting a number of events to hopefully engage the broader public, such as yourself, on this important issue of AI-generated media. This webinar is actually trying to address the growing concern regarding AI-driven disinformation and the potential that it has to destabilize European democracies. Of course, with the rise of artificial intelligence generated media and the fears mounting over electoral interferences, today's event will actually feature different presentations and discussions from very interesting experts that we have invited about the strategies that we can follow moving forward for safeguarding democratic processes that EU values are based on, and for also promoting media literacy. So with that, I should actually give the floor to the project coordinator, Federica Russo. But just before, I would like to ask all of the participants, since the number is very high, I would like to ask you to pose any questions at any time during the session in the chat, because we cannot ask you to unmute yourselves, because then it would be difficult to organize. So please do feel free to pose any questions at any time, and I will be moderating them, so I will be asking them to our panelists and our keynote speakers. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Federica Russo, that is a professor of philosophy and ethics and technoscience at Utrecht University, and also the project coordinator of Solaris. So Federica.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, for the kind introduction. Allow me a few seconds to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully now you see it. I'm very pleased today to give a very brief introduction of our project Solaris, the full title of which is Strengthening Democratic Engagement through Value-Based Generative Adversarial Networks. And allow me only two small notes on the title. As you can see, this series of webinars that we are organizing really focus on the core central topic of the project, which is democratic engagement. Interestingly enough, when we wrote the proposal, we thought that generative adversarial networks were really the thing to look at. And by the time the project was funded, it turned out that technology had already made important steps. And that's why we are talking about generative AI more broadly today. A very brief introduction to the consortium. It is an international consortium mainly based in Europe that has expertise from the academic and non-academic sector. And disciplinary speaking, we cover philosophy and ethics of technology, semiotics and media studies, international relations and law, computer science, citizen science, and journalism and media. This places us in a unique position to address questions related to deepfakes, AI-generated content in media from this interdisciplinary perspective. But we also feel that we need to engage more broadly to the public to explain what we are achieving in the project. Allow me to present our objectives now. We have three main objectives. The first one is to understand the technical and sociopolitical potential of generative AI, and this we do from the various disciplines that are involved in the project. Second, we try co-create options and regulatory innovation for generative AI risk mitigations. For these activities are currently in the making. And finally, co-design value-based AI-generated outputs to enhance digital citizenship and democracy. Likewise, our main activities are currently in the making, so I hope you can stay connected with us and see what we will develop in the coming months. I will now give you a brief overview of our use cases where the research has happened already. And the first one has to do with how people get to trust AI-generated content. And what you see there is our map to explain what happens to normal users when they are exposed to deepfakes. And the trust, kind of the gist of our research has shown that you cannot just focus on the quality of the video or of the picture, or in other words, you cannot only focus on the artifact. So we have focused instead on the idea of perceived trustworthiness from the perspective of the user, and you have to place this in the broad network of relations that happen and in which a deepfake is embedded. So you shouldn't just look at how good a video is, but you should get an understanding of how and when it is generated and circulated on social media, but also who is the target, what kind of policy and legislative intervention is in place, and what kind of public discourse is built around a given deepfake or a given video. For this has involved empirical research from our side, but also important relations with the stakeholders to understand how we can communicate this and make it a useful resource for a policymaker. Our second use case, which is actually in the making, will focus on a specific part of this network approach that I just showed, namely the policy and legislative intervention and the online circulation. We will be working with stakeholders from media and journalism, simulate the spreading of deepfake to test the solidity of existing mitigation measures. Our third use case asks whether there is any good that we can we can do with AI-generated content, or in other words, whether we can have AI for good. And in this use case, we will focus on another part of this network, which is the online circulation and the public discourse. In this part of the project, we will be working with citizens to co-create AI-generated content that might convey positive and constructive messages. And of course, there will be a lot to be said about what counts as a good and positive message, something that we cannot take for granted. So in my in the minute that remains allowed to me. So last week we had a webinar devoted to generative AI and geopolitical disruption. This week, as it has already been announced by Yasmin, we focus on generative AI and democratic resilience. And we also have a hybrid event in preparation, which will take place in February 2025 at the European Parliament and online, where we will be focused on AI literacy in the places of good health and well-being. So I'm very pleased to welcome today Andreas Jungherr. Andreas holds the chair for political science at the University of Bamberg. His research interests include the effects of digital technology on society, political communication, and computational social science. He's the author of Retooling Politics, How Digital Media is Shaping Democracy and Digital Transformation of the Public Arena. As the widespread deployment of AI in society has raised awareness of the technology's economic, social, and political consequences, Professor Jungherr's keynote speech today aims to focus on key developments and issues on the impact of generative AI on politics and democracy. I'm very, very happy that you accepted our invitation, Andreas, and just give me the time to unshare my screen, and the floor will be yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Federica, and thank you for the kind invitation and the opportunity to present some thoughts and some ideas I've been noodling around, focusing more specifically on well, generative AI and democracy. Now let's see if I've learned anything during the COVID area and managed to share my screen. If we think about generative AI in politics, I think it's always important to figure out, okay, what are the I mean, where are the access points? Where does something change? So are we dealing with something really new, or are we dealing with something that is that we have understood in other contexts and so? And I think if we are thinking about generative AI, it's very helpful to start thinking about, okay, what does that do to the options that political actors face? So what does generative AI allow political actors, be they activists, be they parties, or be they citizens, to do? And here I would say, in thinking about that, I think there are at least 3 points that are interesting and that actually might change things or might impact the balance of power or the way we experience politics. And I think on the one hand, that is that generative AI provides cheap access to standardized consultancy services. So generative AI allows especially local campaigns or new political actors to be more professional in their planning, in their activities. It also provides cheap and quick content creation. These are also interesting options for campaigns and low resource actors. And on a more structural level, I would argue there's a shift that we're experiencing since generative AI provides a new interface to politics and the public arena. And during the next 15 minutes or so, I would like to play that through and extend a little bit on these ideas. So what do I mean with generative AI provides kind of professionalized services? So if you just open up your generative AI of choice and start playing through some simple role-playing games. So I'm a candidate for local office of a progressive party. This is my situation. Please construct a media plan for me. Or how should I spend the last week of the campaign? With which type of events or show should I be doing? And it turns out already kind of out of the box solutions are there that are quite helpful. So I cut them off at the first point. But if you play that yourself, you basically find out that the thing has a lot of ideas what you could do, and they're not at the face of it totally ridiculous. This could also be kind of a service that consultancies give if they basically train specialized AIs or specialized plugins, like some have already done, where you see that from a consultancy perspective, you have some standardized solutions that you always put out, and if the AI learns about them, that is then suddenly available to everybody, even if you couldn't afford kind of a professional media or ad agency. So what happens here is simply by kind of role playing and asking the AI or having the AI tutor you as a candidate, you gain major access points regarding or major levels regarding your professionalization of the campaign. You gain access to services that otherwise would have cost you a lot of money, or that basically were restricted to state or national level campaigns. So what does that do? That of course makes local campaigns potentially more dynamic, but that also opens up for low resource campaigns a more professional way of thinking about campaigns. Similar connected to that is that the generative AI changes the economics of content creation. So generative AI allows campaigns and activists to produce content and variations of content that can happen very, very quickly. So you can construct texts. This could be social media posts. This could be emails. This could be constituency letters. That you can then have the AI kind of produce variations on, where you basically say, okay, this is my platform. Those are the topics that are important to me. Now, please write a letter for a young voter, first-time voter. What are they interested in regarding my platform? Now, please write something for a senior citizen who might actually be voting instead of the young voter. So you have the same platform, and you have the AI to produce varied content that actually speaks to the constituency that you might be having. You could also think about, if you're thinking about migrant communities, having them translate your content and make your content available in other languages. Again, these are options that kind of well-resourced campaigns had always. But now we see that also on the down ticket races, that this stuff becomes available. This could make campaigns more accessible and more open to people who would otherwise have difficulties reaching the campaigns. Similarly, campaigns can create images and audio in a very kind of convincing or illustrative way. Why is that important? I mean, images and audio can make your messages kind of more interesting. If you're thinking about being available on social media, their kind of symbol images always help in gaining distribution. Similarly, you could run you could have a spot where you have AI generated audio content, which makes the spot more interesting. So all of that means you have a lot of options of making the content that you create more attractive and also more shareable. So you could increase your visibility on online platforms. The interesting thing, if we think about that normatively, is that a good thing? So as you might have noticed, I haven't talked about the type of actor who might be using that and how that might be using that for normatively more wishful goals than others. But the interesting thing there is basically how you think normatively about the role of parties and political actors in politics. And usually, if I'm talking with political scientists, there are basically two camps. So the one camp says, yeah, well, parties are necessary, and if they are able to do a better job, then it's fine. And if generative AI allows them to do a better job of activating people, involving them in politics, making politics more interesting, speaking to them more along the lines of their interests, then that's fine. So if you're thinking about that, then generative AI might be actually a good thing, because it allows parties to become better at communicating and better at campaigning, better at making politics visible. But then there's the other camp that is then basically saying, okay, parties are at best a necessary evil, and basically they're out there simply for manipulating people. And allowing them to become better at that, better communicating, means they become better at manipulating people. Then, of course, you would be saying, okay, generative AI might create actually an issue, because it would allow parties to pretend to be more on the side of the people and manipulate them better. So thinking about that normatively, I would argue it depends always a little bit on how you see the role of the party and how you see the role of campaigning and political communication. If you see that as a good thing for democracy, then generative AI is a good thing. But if you would be then saying, okay, I have my doubts about that, then of course that creates doubt there as well. I would argue a core issue here, or a core question here that we have to ask is, who is likely to innovate? And what does that then do on what type of actor is using AI or is using AI successfully? And if we look back at other waves of digital innovation, I would argue that we see there that there is always an incentive for the challenger of the status quo to innovate more actively or experiment more aggressively with the new technology and then becoming better at it than the established players. So the established players are kind of adapted to the state of the communication environment as is, have invested a lot of money, a lot of resources, personnel in that, are very, very good at that. So they have lower kind of innovation incentives. Well, the challengers is kind of is moving to the communication environment as is, and is then saying, here are new opportunities that we can use. Let's optimize on them. So they potentially are more aggressive and more successful at innovating and more open to that. And that then, of course, potentially kind of creates a let's say, relative advantages on the challengers side. And what we're seeing at the moment, unfortunately, especially in Europe, that a lot of the challenges that we're seeing are not necessarily challenging the political status quo to integrate more people and to invigorate democracy, but we're seeing challenges that are there that are actually therefore restricting democratic rights and also kind of creating a more nationalist or obstructive democracy or polity there. So what we're seeing there is, since the challenge that we're experiencing to the political arena at the moment, or to the political status quo, is kind of a challenge for a restrictive form of democracy, or sometimes even autocracy, we have a risk there that these tools are actually more used or more helpful to these challenges to democracy than those parties who are more committed to that. But I would say that that is not necessarily something that lies with AI as such, so with the tool, but this lies with the kind of innovation incentives that are there. So that we have established players who are disincentivized to innovate, so they're not using the new opportunities of the tools. And unfortunately, the challengers are kind of more happy to innovate and are more active in that space, and therefore use these tools to make their challenge more successful or more attractive. So that could contribute a risk. We also see some expectations there, and we already heard them in the beginning, that AI also brings some sorts of risks regarding disinformation. Here I would be more, let's say, sanguine about this. So if content production is cheap, so of course is disinformation production there. So it could be that if content is cheap, then disinformation is cheap. So potentially we could see kind of actors that are kind of polluting the information environment and spamming it with wrong information that might be difficult to disentangle from actual information. We see that already with text, with images. I think we see that more on the illustrative side, but there's also some problem regarding audio content where we already saw some fakes that are potentially difficult to disentangle. So there is a risk regarding this. But then I would argue, and here follow some colleagues, Felix Simon and Sascha Altay and Hugo Messier, who then said, yeah, well, the production might be easier, but if we're thinking about the distribution challenges that are connected with AI and that stay the same for AI content and normal content, then we see there are some structural challenges that are still there. So I can produce stuff, but I need to get people to pay attention to that stuff. So how can I get it in front of people so they can react to that? So the distribution channels actually matter. And there, then one would argue that the structures that are in place, so the digital platforms, but also the traditional media systems that are out there, have, of course, a responsibility in trying to identify that content and also stopping its spread. Some have been more successful than others. Unfortunately, media, especially traditional media, has some economic incentives of pushing this content and making it more visible. But we have seen that platforms can be very successful in identifying especially these kind of coordinated spreading events and then slowing them down a little bit. So I would argue, yes, there's that opportunity of producing more convincing fakes more cheaply, but then again, there are some underlying structural challenges that are there that might be probably will stop this from being a kind of massive extinction event of the public arena. So I would say the disinformation threat is maybe not as prominent as we sometimes feel if we look at the coverage. Now, the final thing or the final point that I wanted to make is that generative AI might also become an interface for us to access politics or to access the public arena. So think about that as the chatbot assistants in your phone with which you communicate and then say, okay, please tell me what were the 5 most important events that happened today. So you don't go anymore to the news app of your choice, but you ask your device, tell me what is the most important thing that happened in politics. And then kind of the AI-enabled device goes out into the net and pulls all the information together and provides you a summary of what happened. Now, that is for the political junkies among us. That is an awesome that's an awesome world, because we can then kind of interrogate the AI, interrogate the information. But that of course means that we become that we become kind of dependent on the selection criteria or the way that AI is shaping information. So what we see here is some ways how that might happen. So you have the summary of events. You might generate kind of party chatbots that allow you to kind of interrogate a artificial party representative about the platform of the party in the language that is right for you. And you might also get some monitoring devices or services about what is happening in the world. Also for us kind of democracy scholars, it's also interesting because it could be integrated in the new deliberative platforms and create some options there. And I think, I mean, the mechanisms, if we're thinking about the mechanisms, we already see that there's great potential there, that these large language models can condense language that we're seeing and surface views that otherwise might remain hidden. It can also help in putting that together or summarizing that. And it might also help us to get a better handle on a fragmented media environment. But that also has a other side to that coin. By this type of summary, we already see that the AI-driven features are already there that might also be a problem. Because if you're thinking about language models, they're kind of creating averages about specific classes. So that means that, for example, kind of voice that is less kind of that is more average, or that is not average, that is somewhat on the outside, somewhat provocative, and so might be simply through the technological workings of the generative AI might be pushed to the side and become invisible. So maybe kind of in relying on these language models as access points to politics, we introduce the biases within these models and reinforce them if we're dealing with politics. And the other thing is, if we're thinking about interfaces, they potentially might pull away attention and monetization opportunities for the institutions that we rely on to create political information. So the final thing is, AI is not kind of a kind of neutral thing, but we have also commercial companies that are pushing that. And the more we start relying on AI in the public arena and for political actors, the more kind of powerful these companies become, and especially for European actors, or let's say everybody outside the US, this becomes a big issue. So how much of my public arena or how much of my political discourse do I feel comfortable with hosting in a sometimes subjectively more aligned polity than others. So how much of that kind of power do I want to give companies, and how much of that power do I want to give to companies that are not based in my polity? So where does that leave us? I would say there are a lot of potentials there. Where these potential come to play out, I think depends on which type of actor is ready to innovate, is open to play with that, experiment with that, and use that. and also we might experience some power shifts in politics and democracy, and that of course needs to be monitored, and especially institutions have to think about, okay, how does that what does that mean for their role? So slightly over time, but thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Yeah, thank you.
No worries at all, and thank you for the very interesting talk. I, for one, learned a lot, and I have a lot of questions already, but I do hope to get some questions from the audience. And as also Andrew, my colleague, wrote in the chat, please do write your questions. Don't feel shy, and we will hopefully be addressing some. So, first of all, Professor, I would like to ask you, I found it very interesting what you said about the challenges that AI-generated media, and in general, you said media poses to democratic rights. But how do you think the media, like what role do you think the media can play in restoring public trust in journalism, especially in electoral processes? And especially given the fact that there is a rise of misinformation because of AI-generated content. So what do you think should be the strategies that we should prioritize in order to restore this trust?
I think, I mean, I have some issues with the word trust in democracies, because if we think about democracies, usually they started out from a place of non-trust or distrust. So actually we have, I mean, democracies are structured in a way that we have institutions that are in competition with each other, that are monitoring each other, and that are transparent about the processes and so. And therefore we can then say, okay, we have interested parties in all of that, but we created this balance that is there between these actors. We know that they are actually that nefarious actors are kind of surfaced and can be attacked there. So the thing I would start out with arguing, I do not necessarily need a place where I have blind trust of the public in democracy or institutions. It's more about, okay, do I have as the public the availability of accountability? Is there a way in democracies or in systems to hold people and institutions accountable? And there I would argue, especially if we're talking about the media, it's important that the media comes back to a place where it says, okay, this is our product. Don't trust the product, trust our process. So like we do in science, we have open science because we know that we cannot trust scientists because they are self-interested people. So we have an open science process that we then say, okay, that is your finding, fine, but now show me the receipts. So everybody can then check up on that. And I would argue that it's important for the media to come back to that point where it then says, okay, we have a given process that can be interrogated, that can be contested, and that is why we come out at this with this product. So I would argue we are currently too much in an environment where we expect trust in institutions, while at the same time the failure of these institutions are as visible as it was never before. So I would argue, instead of asking for more trust in media, politics, science, the institutions need to make the homework and then say, that is our process, we police this process, and therefore the product that you're seeing here as a fact-generating mechanism, as an epistemological process, is better than that which you find on the YouTube University or something like that. So it's about process, not about the identity of the speaker.
Thank you so much for the very clear answer. And we actually did get another question in the chat from Basir Rayat. He says, on the distribution systems, Professor Jungherr mentioned one area that needs to be studied and penalized. Is information platforms profiting from disinformation where knowingly posting deepfake video advertisement, making them co-conspirator of online fraud? And should the EU summon big bosses of online platforms similar to the EU Congress? This is a very interesting question, and actually also kind of linked with a question that I had in mind about the role that Digital Services Act will now play in Europe. So maybe if you could kind of address both, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and especially the economics of information distribution is, I think, an interesting point. I think since we are all so interested in politics, we often forget that this is a niche interest among the public. So if we're thinking about online platforms, most of the money that they're making is not through political content. And if you're thinking about the Facebook Threads development currently, where Facebook is saying, okay, we have a platform where people can interact, and we keep politics as far away from this platform as possible. So this is about everything else except politics, and they make money off that. So I think the risk that we're seeing here is by kind of pulling the platforms or holding the platforms too accountable for the information that is on there, is that these platforms will be saying, look, you with the news and you with the politics, have fun somewhere else. We, the major platforms, are ignoring that, and here is now entertainment and sports and all the other stuff in your life besides politics. And I think the risk that is associated with that is that we lose sight of politics in the mainstream, and that it becomes more difficult for political actors to reach people who are not interested in politics. And then we see basically the American problem, that basically there are 40% of the American populace who are basically saying, I'm fed up with politics, leave me alone with that. And the only people who are fighting about politics are 30% Republicans and 30% Democrats, who are then more extreme than the middle would be, or the moderates would be. But since they are out of the process and they pulled out of the process, basically the extreme sides are deciding about politics. And that is something that I would want to avoid. So therefore, I would be more careful in kind of then putting too much pressure or too much emphasis on the supposed responsibilities of the platforms regarding that, especially if the platforms are investing in pushing against that, because actually the platforms are the best allies that we have in kind of identifying coordinated behavior, because from the outside that is much more difficult to identify than the platforms themselves can. So I would try to pull them more in, and I would try to avoid this kind of adversarial position that sometimes we get in the current discourse, because then the whole information system deteriorates. So yeah, with the Digital Service Act, I think the thing there is always, is that worth the hassle for the international companies? So I think there's a lot of European fan fiction going about the power of EU regulation. And I think what we're currently seeing is that a lot of US tech firms are basically saying, okay, the European market is nice, but not that important. So if you want to do your liability games, fine, then we're not of that market anymore. So think about the rollout of artificial intelligence services, or the non-rollout in European countries. There we already seeing that these companies are then saying, look, your market is not as interesting as you believe your market is. So there I would also argue that we need to think about kind of not lionize our regulation powers there, but also think about, okay, how can I get back to a kind of mutual shaping instead of kind of an adversarial position that we currently seem to be heading in.
Thank you so much, Professor. One last question, hopefully very quick one. How do you think governments can balance the need to combat misinformation, but at the same time to protect free speech in especially, let's say, polarized environments? So as a tool that governments have, they can offer regulation, but how can they also make this trade-off with protection of free speech? Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, I would argue is not to overemphasize the threat of disinformation. So currently, if you're thinking at the literature, there are a few studies out that are looking at the potential spread and the potential effects of disinformation in the US. But I don't know about kind of reliable studies in the EU that are looking at that. I know a ton of studies that are looking at the effects of countermeasures to disinformation. but I know very little about studies that are actually trying to identify the level of the threat and through spread and effects. So that means that we're potentially currently kind of telling a nice story about the threat of disinformation that is not necessarily fact-based. So from a government perspective, I would argue the first thing would be, if I'm thinking that is an important threat, I would try to finance studies that are looking and trying to identify the actual threat level and then think about how to address that. Currently, my feeling is that a lot of political actors are looking at the kind of unruly public arena that we're seeing in digital communication environments and looking at problematic kind of electoral results and connecting the two. And here I would be very, very careful in automatically connecting them, because what we're seeing, especially regarding disinformation, most threats about disinformation that reach many people, or the disinformation that reaches many people, reaches them through mass media, since mass media are repeating some of the claims that they're seeing online, or through political elites. And this is then this is the point that is a much more thorny issue. And how do I deal with mass media, and how do I deal with political elites? But there you have the lever where you have the actual deterioration of the information environment. What we're seeing online is much more on the margins, or much more regarding with an unruly public or so. So I would be more careful in that regard, and I would try to regain more handle on the other side.
Thank you so much. Very curious now to hear our next speech by Alessio Iacona, which could be related, because Alessio is actually a journalist at ANSA, that is the leading news agency in Italy, and also one of the top ranking in the world, as you may know. And Alessio is also a collaborator, member of SOLARIS project. So let's hear it from you, Alessio, and from the perspective of journalists.
So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me the chance to think about how the role of a journalist is changing in this new era where generative AI is having such a success, in this news era where people have the chance to really fabricate their own reality and how can I say, and push this reality to their peer and in their own environment. And for me, it's very interesting to think about my role, because I grow up hearing people say that the journalists are the watchdog of democracy, and it's interesting to analyze how this is changing nowadays. So if I can start my presentation, I will try to address this. I'll get straight to the point because we are a little over time, but let's do this. So
absolutely.
There you go. So as you can see, I'm starting with this first image, which is of course a deepfake image of Kamala Harris, and this new and an easy communist role. And this is something you can easily find on X, the ex-Twitter social network, where there is this artificial intelligence called Grok, which Elon Musk is training on all the data of Twitter, which has, let's say, less boundaries than other artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence we're dealing with like, for example, Gemini from Google or ChatGPT from OpenAI. And this poses many questions to the people like me, to the journalists, on how if they need to change the way they do their jobs. So let's start with this. Fake news are as old as news themselves, as news itself. Identifying and excluding them has always been one of our jobs as journalists. In the age of the internet and social media, of course, where fake news was a widely used weapon, the arrival of generative AI represents an unprecedented leap forward, because people can, as I said before, fabricate their own reality, and because there can be a small group of people that can manipulate the wider audience. They can create text, images, videos, and they are right now challenging our very ability to distinguish reality from fake. And that is a problem for everyone, of course, but it becomes a bigger problem when you are a journalist and you are to inform the audience. So what's changing in the way we work? Once we were sprinters, and as an essential part of our job was to be the first to break the news. Today, this being the first one to give an information to the wider public is becoming more and more difficult, because the need to be quick doesn't align very well, doesn't get along with the increasingly complex task of source verification, which has always been a part of our job, but at the same time is becoming more and more difficult due to deepfakes. So let's say it's still important for us as journalists, also necessary to catch the news quickly, because there is always this strong competition between different newspaper and journalists. We need to be there before the others. It's also part of our business model, let's say so. But this is just the beginning of an increasingly long journey that turns us into something different, something we can call curators of information. In a world where massive amounts of news circulate faster and across thousands of different channels, causing what we call, infodemic, our task is to organize and piece together the puzzle, not just recognizing and highlighting falsehoods, but also trying to make sense of all these bits of information that are circulating around the internet and that are flooding our reality, let's say. We're shifting, let's say, from being sprinters, as I said before, to ultra trail runners. The distance are longer and the terrain is rougher and more challenging. And let me say, there can be also pain along the way. If someone of you know what ultra trail is and knows what I'm talking about. I want to be very clear on this point. The basics of our job haven't changed at all. The principles of journalism are still accurate source verification, factual reporting, ethical handling of information, and also, and maybe mainly, building a trusting relationship with readers. And these are any of these things are fundamental today as they were in the past. This hasn't changed at all. What has changed is that we as journalists are learning new skills and adding new tools to the ones we had before. Specifically, for example, AI. It can assist, and it does assist already as for many newspapers I know of, in all the stages of news production, from selecting stories among millions of pieces of information that goes, for example, around the internet, to writing, even to also to the dissemination of the news to the public, where they are, when they need them, when they are eager to receive them. That's what AI can do. The key here is that when you are using this technology in a newsroom, you need to inform very clearly your public, because you need to share with them how the process is changing, what kind of technology are you using, why are you using them, to reinforce, let's say, the trust between you and your public, the trust relationship with you and your public. So this means also that our role remains that of gatekeeper of information. The new challenge is first to identify highlights deepfake, which takes more time, requires new skills, and must constantly be updated, and involves new AI-based tools, which are also continuously evolving. Today, a journalist needs to recognize not only fake text, but also deepfake audio and video. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes I must say it's not, and it's more difficult because technology is evolving really fast with new generative AI models released almost every month. And we don't know where this technology is going next. If we listen to what the people who are making this technology, while building up generative AI, is gonna go very fast, and in the next few months we will see technology, LLM, for example, AI that can build video and images that are more real than real. So we need to prepare for this change, and this preparation is a twofold challenge, because on one hand, we need, oh, sorry, I can go with this one, sorry.
No worries.
Here I am back, sorry. I was saying, on one hand, we need specialized training for new journalists that are starting now the profession, and they need to acquire specific skills, which are technological skill and low skills, so they can better understand the dynamics of what's happening around them and account effects while avoiding mistakes with potentially serious consequences. On the other side, we face the need to update the skills of those professionals which are already in the profession since a long time, and we need them because they have an experience. They are we could call them digital migrants. They formed their profession in an analog world, and we need them in the new digital world because they have an experience. We need to capitalize here in the present. And this last aspect is in my opinion, very important, because we can't lose an entire 1 or 2 generation of journalists because they don't know how to face the new scenarios. Good news is that traditional process of verification we have in journalism, we have in all the newsroom works also with deepfakes. And it can be already sufficient for most of the situation to spot, for example, deepfakes. However, the advancement of technology are posing, as I said before, new threats and new challenges to add. The other thing we need to do as journalists is to inform constantly the public of the challenges, of the threats they're facing because of deepfakes and because of this attempt, which is global, to manipulate information, to steer citizens' opinion and choices. Because an informed public is one that can defend itself. It's not an easy task, because we're already seeing in what we call the greater election year of all time, many attempts to change elections and their outcome. For example, we saw it in Czech Republic, we saw it in Great Britain, where for example, deep fake audio of Sir Keir Starmer are circulating and have circulated with his voice when he is abusing his staff, and it was of course all a fake, and this can change the public opinion, can affect the idea they have of what's happening around them. As we speak, newsrooms all around the world are gearing up to tackle this, and ANSA itself has launched 6 years an informational project represented by the Artificial Intelligence Observatory, which I'm the curator of. We organize every year an annual event focused on the evolution and impact of AI technology on society, culture, economy, and work. And our newsroom, for example, is experimenting with AI technology, and we were the first to apply blockchain to our news production so that every news published by ANSA can be verified by the public thanks to the blockchain. So there are tools, and we are trying to use them for good and for to adapt to the new scenario we're in. I'm almost finished, but I want to address this thing, which is very, very important for me. When I started dealing with these topics, and when I started trying to understand what's happening around us and to inform the people about it, I was really concerned about. I had this idea, so that a small groups of people can use the technology to steer the vision and the ideas of a wider public. Nowadays, but this is just my personal experience as a journalist. I have no studies sustaining this, but I want to share it with you. The same. My idea today is that the problem can be the public itself. I mean, the fakes can indeed be used to spread false idea, but the impression I have is that there are many people in the wider public that are eager to use generative AI technology to literally fabricate their own reality and to push it towards their peer to make them change idea or to convince them of something different. And nowadays, it's plenty of tools to do this. Some of these tools are being more and more fine-tuned to avoid misuse, but there are also tools, AI tools that can be used to produce deep fakes. So I think that the greatest enemy a journalist has to face today is confirmation bias, is the idea that these people have, and even if it's wrong for some reason, they don't want to change it. They are also using this tool to win other people on their own idea. And another problem we have, and I'm closing with this, is that when I talk about all this changing taking place, updating of skills, tools that are being experimented inside newspapers and so on, I'm talking about structured newsroom. This means that outside the many newsroom that we have all around the world, there is plenty of freelance journalists which are alone and which are facing all this change, all these things that are changing the new scenario without the same means and they don't have the same means that newsroom have. So we should think also how to help all the journalists that are in place, that are working, even the ones that are outside the newsroom, to update their skill, have the right tools to work with, understand the change, and be part of this transformation we're facing, upon which depends democracy itself, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessio. And this was a very interesting talk. I don't really see any questions from the public in the chat, and we're actually running a little bit over time. So if you don't mind, we can move on and go to
Please
the
do.
panel discussion, and then hopefully eventually after the panel discussion or during the panel discussion, we will hear more on your perspective also of journalists. So in the panel today on promoting democratic resilience in the European context, we hope to use the knowledge of our invited experts to explore possible strategies for ensuring European democracies to mitigate the impacts of artificial intelligence generated media and disinformation. Which also includes ideas around platform regulation, media governance, and collaboration across the continent. So we have invited 4 panelists, experts on the matter. I will just quickly name them, and then hopefully they will get into more details about their careers and expertise. So Mariëlle Wijermars is an assistant professor in internet governance at Maastricht University with expertise in internet freedom, human rights of internet policy, and platform governance. Maximilian Conrad is a professor of political science at the University of Iceland with expertise in European integration and the EU political communication and post-truth politics. Paula Gürtler is a researcher at the Center of European Policy Studies with expertise in applied ethics, ethics of new technologies, and AI ethics. And eventually, Joshua Glick is a visiting associate professor of film and electronic arts at Bard College with expertise in media literacy, deepfakes, and civic uses of emerging technologies. And they're here to share their expertise with us. So I give the floor to the panelists. And after that, we will take questions from the audience in the chat always. And of course, panelists can also direct questions to each other. And I ask also Professor Jungherr and Alessio to share your questions with the panelists as well. So with that, I invite our panelists to speak. Thank you.
Do you want us to start by introducing ourselves, or?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you can start by introducing yourself and say a little bit more about your expertise, because of course I went through it very quickly. If you have any comments on the discussions that were already made, or if you have any other highlights. So we have quite a bit of time for the panel discussion. You're free to discuss between yourselves or with the keynote speakers. Go ahead, please introduce yourself. Yeah. Maybe I can give an order. This way it's easier. Yeah, Maximilian, maybe you could start.
All right. So thanks a lot for the invitation. My name is Maximilian Conrad. I'm professor of political science at the University of Iceland. I mean, as you mentioned, I work on questions connected to or kind of at the interface of European integration and I mean, the public sphere, more recently, disinformation, misinformation, what we still call post-truth politics. I'm currently leading a Horizon Europe project that's called Reclaiming Liberal Democracy in the Post-Factual Age, where we basically look at, on the one hand, the impact of mis and disinformation on liberal democracy, and then also explore possible ways to mitigate those challenges. Previously, we also had a Jean Monnet network that was more specifically on mis and disinformation in relation to the legitimation and delegitimation of European integration. And from that, we basically got this idea that we need to approach these topics from a much broader starting point. So that's what we're doing now. And we're basically seeing post-truth politics as a challenge, as a more fundamental challenge to liberal democracy, in the sense that it is often it often goes hand in hand with agendas of certain politicians that actually try to undermine much more fundamental values, liberal values that we associate with democracy. So that's kind of my starting point.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we are really looking forward to this discussion. So then I asked Mariëlle maybe to introduce herself and a little
Great.
bit more.
Thank you so much. Thank you also to the organizer for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So I work mostly on how authoritarian states try to control the flows of information. In previous years, mostly working on Russian efforts to do so. And of course, this is on the one hand domestically. So how do they try to manipulate platforms, try to control how platforms work? What is the relationship between states and platform companies? But of course, as we know, these efforts of Russia, they're not contained to the Russian Federation itself. They also transcend these borders. And unfortunately, the threat of Russian interference within European politics is very real. So in this respect, I'm also working in a Current Horizon project called ARM, where we examine these efforts on the part of authoritarian states to suppress information across borders. So a particular form of transnational repression. So this is the perspective that I'm coming from. So especially this relationship between states and platforms and the complexities. And I think that also came up a little bit in the opening keynote. So this dominance of platform companies in being crucial to our responses, but at the same time, they're also very crucial for how we actually understand the problems we are facing. We depend on platforms for access to data. We depend on platforms in identifying these inauthentic behaviors and exposing them and allowing us to respond. So there are multiple ways in which platforms have a very dominant position. And of course, for AI, there's an additional context in the sense that many of them are also active developers of AI. So the multiplicity of dependence on platforms, I think, is a very relevant one for us. But from my perspective, so more from the side of how authoritarian states and also states that are experiencing democratic backsliding, how they might abuse these conditions of the information environment for their own objectives. I would really want to highlight and bring to the table the question of democratic backsliding and how it intersects with how the EU tries to respond to, for example, foreign interference. And of course, AI now becomes one of those new avenues that can be used for increasing these activities, what the EU calls FIMI activities. And when I look at how the EU tries to regulate, so this entire package from the Media Freedom Act to local advertising and so on, unfortunately, what you often see is that there's limited attention to the fact that indeed the democratic state within member states is very different. So there are very real concerns that some of these regulatory mechanisms might actually be abused by states. So on the one hand, of course, efforts to try and protect democratic discourses, to protect journalism, this all depends on the state of media pluralism as it is. So we might give media preferential status, but at the same time, it does presuppose that there actually is free media within that state and that there is a degree of media pluralism. So I think that would be a topic which I would like to draw into our discussion. So to take very seriously this threat that might emanate from the fact that we see democratic backsliding in quite a number of European member states, and how there might actually be a perverse relationship between those EU responses that are trying to increase the resilience of democratic institutions, if they might actually serve in the end to undermine them. So this would be the perspective I would like to offer on this roundtable today.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I actually do have two questions, both for Maximilian and yourself, but maybe it would be best if we go around and the panelists all introduce themselves and then introduce the questions. So if that's okay with you, Paula, maybe you could go ahead.
Yeah, I'll keep it short so that we can jump into the discussion. I'm Paula Gürtler, by now Associate Researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in the Unit for Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation and Digital Economy, GRID for short. I also recently joined the Center for Environmental and Technology Ethics, Prague, as a PhD researcher. So I have two hats, but I understand that my role at CEPS might be more interesting since that is not an academic institution, so not a university. In my research at CEPS, I focus around the topics of another European Horizon project called AI Code, which aims to develop AI tools and training for media professionals to be better equipped to respond to the various challenges, to identify deepfakes or AI-generated content, text and images, and also videos, for example. And yeah, I think for me, Of course, the regulatory context of AI Act, the General Data Protection Regulation, and the Digital Services Act are super interesting. So I'm curious to bring in those perspectives, and also the Framework Convention on the use of AI and human rights, democracy, and rule of law by the Council of Europe. But then on the other hand, I'm also curious about what has already been said kind of in the first presentations that we've heard on the context within which AI is happening. So the social, economic, and also epistemic conditions within which AI is happening, and we are making it happen. Okay.
Thank you so much, Paula. And Joshua, maybe you could do the same, please. You could introduce yourself briefly so we get to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation and for planning this convening. My name is Josh Glick. I'm a film and media studies professor at Bard College, and my expertise is really on the United States. So, I mean, perhaps I can offer a kind of comparative perspective to this conversation. And I've done a number of public-facing projects. I'd be happy to put some links in the chat, online curriculum I did with some colleagues when I was a fellow at MIT, Media Literacy in the Age of Deepfakes. I co-curated an exhibition that was at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York, Deepfake, Unstable Evidence on Screen. And some of my research and teaching sort of looks at issues of nonfiction arts, but also the flip side in terms of, say, dis and misinformation and things like that. You know, one thing that perhaps we could get into, I know there's been a lot of discussion on sort of policy and sort of high-level, top-level sort of ways of thinking about the sort of information landscape. A lot of my work, as I mentioned, sort of deals with issues of digital media literacy, and I think it's sort of ripe for a kind of reimagining of what that means in terms of how that lives in the classroom and what that means for just everyday people. Obviously, you know, media literacy isn't a kind of, you know, cure for, you know, some of the, you know, real challenges on the table, but, you know, I'm thinking of media literacy both in terms of how we sort of cultivate, you know, discerning, you know, viewers and listeners of information in a kind of contextualized fashion, media literacy in terms of, you know, thinking about the creation of different kinds of media, right, as sort of content creators, and then also for issues of advocacy, right, that you know, media literacy can be connected to how sort of everyday citizens advocate for the kind of media and information landscape that they, you know, that they want to live within. So I'll leave it right there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you all so much. And so this is going to give us a very general perspective, a very broad perspective of, let's say, every point of view, which makes this session even more interesting. So I'll start with with a question addressed to Professor Conrad. If you don't mind, I called you Maximilian. How do you think? Yeah, I go with the first name basis because I may mispronounce your last name. Sorry. So how does the concept of post-truth populism that you also worked on in your research influence European integration and democracy? And what do you think are the strategies that in the EU we can employ to reinforce democratic values in this context specifically, while also aiming at, again, public trust, which is, we had another interesting discussion on trust. So I would like to also hear your point of view on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very broad question that I hope I can at least give some kind of some openings to for the discussion. I think so. When we talk about post-truth populism, we basically mean to explore the link between populism and what we call post-truth politics. I know post-truth politics is a pretty contested concept, but still one that we somehow cling to for some reason, because we do think that, I mean, in this age of digital media, kind of, in a sense, the whole epistemic basis of liberal democracy is being undermined, in the sense that we also seem to lose a sense of, I mean, what facts actually are, how facts are created, what the scientific method is that is underlying all these things. And instead, we have a resurgence of populism where very often draws on this idea of there's a corrupt liberal elite on the one hand, and there's an authentic pure people on the other hand. And I mean, those distinctions might be overplayed, but I think, I mean, we do see that there is this resurgence of populism. And we also see, and a lot of kind of scholarship in media and communication studies has been devoted to this, that kind of the digital age is one where kind of the information environment is changing in such a way that post-truth communication fits populist politics really, really well. So I guess that's in a sense a challenge for democracy, and in particular for liberal democracy more specifically, but it is also a problem for European integration. But I think, it is in a sense the identical problem for European integration, more specifically as it is for liberal democracy in general, and that is that on the one hand, post-truth politics, on the other hand, populism. Those are basically developments that kind of play into the same kind of sentiment, and most importantly, that not only exploit kind of what is perceived as mis or distrust in, or lack of trust in established institutions, media, science, scientific expertise, but it's also something that actively fuels kind of resentment towards these institutions. I think that's something that we need to be quite concerned about, and that's also kind of my point of departure when I'm talking about artificial intelligence in this context, because I think that artificial intelligence is something that reinforces all these trends, or at least has the potential to reinforce these trends. My emphasis is very much on citizenship education, so I think we're going to talk about that at a later point. But I've done a lot of interviews with journalists, so I kind of know their side or their perspective on this matter. And I think what's interesting here in this context is maybe also to see that this idea of the people distrusting the institution of journalism, or distrusting public service media, or distrusting mainstream media, is not really reflected in the data that we have. If we look at what the most trusted media are, then we still see a lot of public service media institutions. We see a lot of the established mainstream media. But still we see also that this is something that populists play on quite fundamentally. So I think that's what I mean by not only exploiting this sense of distrust towards the media, but also actually fueling it and fueling resentment towards media. So I think that's something that we should discuss further.
Absolutely. Thank you for this insight. Actually, this is really this takes me to our to the Solaris project, and one of the use cases that Federica explained in the beginning. It's our third use case where we are exploring ways of using the technology itself in specific deepfakes to promote democratic values. I'm wondering if you have an insight on that, and how you think these technologies could be, let's say, leveraged for good, politically speaking, let's say. And this is a question addressed to all of the panelists, not just to Maximilian. So if you do want to comment on that, please do go ahead. And then I have more questions for the other panelists as well. So yeah, my question is exactly how we can use the technologies themselves that we see as a risk, maybe in a good way, to, I don't know, increase media literacy or digital citizenship, if anyone has any ideas on that. Maybe actually
I can just jump in. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna move quickly through, just a couple of these kinds of case studies, and there's whole bodies of literature about each of these different strands, but both for, say, electoral politics as well as maybe movement politics in the realm of the arts. We have, AI, the sort of applications of some AI or even deepfake technologies being used for kind of identity protection in some kinds of documentary projects. Welcome for Chechnya is, one of the biggest documentary films, and Ryan Laney, that VFX artist, has worked on a number of different kinds of projects like that, where AI is used to create a kind of digital veil or mask to protect vulnerable subjects before the camera. You also have, AI tools can be used, obviously, to, process large data sets, finding out what, communities are sort of underserved or receiving, less services in particular, neighborhoods or areas. I mean, this is, in a kind of like urban infrastructure and sort of city demographics, kind of work. I think it's been mentioned so far, AI is translation tools and ways of communicating with different constituencies and different communities and just helping with communication across linguistic barriers. And then, going back to the arts, which is, part of where I'm at, I mean, AI, there are artists today, computational artists, algorithmic artists sort of using AI to create installations that essentially constitute, artful warnings of how the technology can be used for malicious or nefarious purposes, right? And sort of using the technology essentially to critique it. And in the sort of art world, this is, something which there is a lot of interest in. So I'll just leave it right there.
Thank you so much. So just to clarify, any of you panelists, you can jump in anytime and comment on what the other experts have said. Just one more question, actually, always in this relation, is I think to Paula, who was saying that she works on another project called AI Code, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So just to also look at this from a different level of abstraction, I was wondering what kind of role does the technology play here in training, let's say, more media literacy for professionals? Okay, we talked about it for citizens, but now from a more professional perspective, how do you leverage the technology to kind of offer the tool to increase awareness and
Yeah, of course. Like Solaris, we also have multiple use cases and different AI services that we're offering. But I think the one that is most relevant for this question would be it's actually a simulator that helps media professionals play around with like, okay, so this is how generative AI models can be changed with like, if I change this parameter a little bit or at this like fine-tuning aspect, so they can kind of like play around and see the results, the changes that happen. What if I keep interacting with it? It starts adapting to my kind of prompts that I give. So understanding and how generative AI works. So it's really about the mental models that media professionals have about how does generative AI works, so that they can spot it in generated text. It also has a tool as well where you can insert different content, and it kind of detects claims, which you can then check if they are substantiated claims or if they are kind of just random claims without a factual basis. It kind of can highlight hate speech or conspiracy narratives. So these are kind of elements to help media professionals be a little bit quicker in understanding, oh, this could be AI generated because I understand how generative AI tools work. So that would be one concrete use case of this project. Maybe if I could also add to the previous question about how we can use generative AI or even deep fakes to promote some of the things that we want. I think it's really important to then do it better, so to speak. So to always have this teachable moment of like, oh, this was, by the way, this was AI generated, and being really transparent in the ways and in the steps in which AI was used in the process of making the art installation, for example, or different kind of communication materials that were used.
Thank you so much. Actually, this makes me think also of our other use case 2, where we want to simulate with journalists what escalation procedures they have in place in case of a disinformation, in case of a fake news spread. And yeah, it could be very interesting to hear more and like read more about the project. So maybe we should keep in touch after this. So I have some other questions from Andrew, actually. The first one is that Mariëlle mentions this democratic backsliding in many EU countries. How is this specifically how does this specifically impact cooperation between member states on key issues, including AI disinformation? Mariëlle?
It's a complicated question. Yeah, it's a very, very ambitious panel. Yeah, so in terms of collaboration between member states, I think on these particular regulations, of course, there's multiple things going on. So on the one hand, you have these are very, very new. So we're still now, a lot of this is still in development. We're still waiting for the right authorities to be established, or these things to become actually enforced. At the same time, of course, we see some initial results, for example, from the DSA about having this transparency on moderation issues. For as far as we see now, there is quite limited information actually contained in those transparency measures. So there's definitely room for improvement there. But in terms of the actual collaboration between EU member states, I think a lot of this actually will not necessarily be that. Of course, in terms of following up on the regulation and whether or not it actually suffices, that is something, of course, that then has to be done in EU context. The reason why I bring in democratic backsliding is much more in the sense that now that we are indeed moving from regulation to enforcement, we should be able to take that into account. So we should, for example, earlier on, we were talking about who are the political actors, who are the media actors. So we're actually differentiating between different type of actors that have different rights. So we do assume that when you are a politician, or if you are a representative of a political party, that then rules for freedom of expression, for example, there is some difference between a political representative or a prime minister and just an average citizen. There might be some differences. So for example, when a platform would feel comfortable to actually intervene, for example, or if they would feel that this is too uncomfortable, and as was discussed earlier, they might want to push political discussions from the platform to begin with. So I think that this is actually the sphere where we might see manipulation happening. So how can you play with the differentiation of actors? So for example, if there's a differentiation that's like official media, that their context should be treated differently. So for example, that it should be kept up longer. Then how does it actually work when there is limited media freedom within that state, or when there is a alignment or maybe even capture of these media organizations by a state? This is the type of cases that I have in mind where we might see some problems emerging. At the same time, responding to that might be difficult because it might actually be with that same member state. So then the question revolves around, is that authority that now has to enforce these new regulations, how independent are they from the government? So I think on those two lines, the conditions within member states actually become very, very prominent. So on the one hand, indeed, there is a lot of collaboration between EU member states in terms of defining what are these threats, how should we respond to them, what is the balance also between those different objectives. So on the one hand, a lot of securitization, but at the same time, of course, also the need to protect human rights. But when we move towards actual enforcement, then the conditions of the political systems within the member states actually become very, very important. So I hope that was a first attempt at answering your question there, but I would be happy to follow up.
Absolutely. So just to follow up, I think also quite relevant to this is that at what point does online content moderation go over the line to become, let's say, authoritarian and to turn into censorship?
Absolutely, very crucial problem, and I think that this is also where, unfortunately, we see what I would say a negative tendency, where the way that we look at, for example, disinformation, it often gets categorized as being mostly an outside problem. And so it is foreign interference, it is outside threat actors try to manipulate and undermine our democratic institutions. And therefore we might be able to detect them, and then we get rid of the outside problem, and then we're safe. But of course, in reality, that's not really the case. In reality, a lot of the potential threats are actually domestic. So either from commercial motivations or political objectives, as we've been talking about before. Populism, of course, is a very important factor here. So this, I think, is quite problematic. So if we see the origin of the problem as just being outside, and we think that we might be able to shield ourselves from that through securitization. So by securitizing all communications and saying that it needs to be monitored to be able to detect those threat actors and so on, then actually what we are doing is securitizing all of these public debates. So of course, there is an actual threat and we need to actually act, but some of the remedies might then actually be worse than the threat that we're trying to solve. And I think there's also something that came up earlier in the discussion, is that we actually lack a lot of information. So we might have some information about, for example, the amount of activities or inauthentic behaviors that we see. At the same time, from those detected activities, we often infer that there is actual engagement with those materials, with that content, and then also that there is an impact. And especially on the latter point, we indeed lack, as was mentioned earlier, we lack research in actually demonstrating this. So we go from very nice reports showing a level of activity to then assuming that it actually has impact. So this is not to say that we should just disregard this threat, because I think that the fact that there is this kind of activity is very, very worrisome. But at the same time, we should be careful to not then overestimate what that impact then directly is, and also what shapes that impact then takes, because this might actually be very different for different subpopulations or for different member states. So the kind of nuanced insights that we need, I think that indeed we need much more research to be able to go there. But at the same time, this type of securitization that I see in this field, I think it does push us towards more interventions that might actually harm democratic deliberation online and the room for this kind of pluralist in the public debate. It might do more harm than how it actually helps us forward.
Thank you. Sorry, your answer, your very well drafted answer actually relates to the question on media literacy. And my question now is, if not moderation, then is media literacy the answer to the problem? Like, is it at all effective with this convincing AI media that now exists? And again, I ask other experts to also jump in if you have any other opinion on this.
If I may, I think, because I very often make the case for education and for media literacy and digital skills and things like this. I mean, maybe first a quick comment on the last comments. I think what we're seeing here is very clearly that there's a lot of things we don't know, so we need to have a lot more research. And I'm always a bit skeptical, because it seems to me that very often the consequence of this lack of research is to say, well, this problem is exaggerated. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but I mean, that's kind of the message that I'm getting from a lot of discussions that I have with other researchers that emphasize the securitization aspect, that say, well, we don't actually know exactly how those things play out, so probably it's exaggerated and end of story. So I think exactly for that reason, we need to have much more research on this. I mean, as I said in my initial remarks, I do think that this argument, for instance, is overplayed, that there is such a high level of distrust in traditional media, in mainstream media, in public service, and so on. I think this is something that is actually being constructed quite a bit by populist politicians, but it also seems to succeed. So I mean, we do see, I mean, it's not coincidental that, I mean, there are demands for defunding public service broadcasting and things like this. But in terms of, so I think there is a tension between regulation and education in the Reclaim project. I mean, that's kind of the discussion that we end up having quite a lot, where I'm more kind of on the education end of the argument, where some of my colleagues are more on the regulation side of the argument. And I think, I mean, if we find intelligent ways to regulate, then there's a lot to be done without liberal democracy crossing over to becoming authoritarian. But we need to do this very carefully. But then again, I mean, having said that, I'm more on the media literacy and the education side of the argument. So I think, and I often make that argument, that it's not so much about somebody stepping in and saying this is disinformation or this is misinformation, this is misleading, so you cannot say it. I mean, that's obviously highly, highly problematic, but that also need not be the approach. So, I mean, my argument is more for a lot of people that I'm discussing this with, and we all have a certain level of education, it doesn't seem to be any kind of problem to I mean, to have that kind of critical attitude to the kind of contents that we're exposed to. And we're pretty good, I would say, at identifying what is fact, what is fake, what is constructed, what is what is generated through AI. And I mean, we had an event just I don't know, last week or the week before, where we had this discussion about artificial intelligence, and there were some people that seemed to think that, I mean, the fight against artificial intelligence is lost, and we won't go anywhere with media literacy or with critical thinking, because the technology is going to advance so fast that we're never going to be able to detect what is real and what is fake. And I really don't buy that argument. For a lot of reasons that maybe we're going to go into. So I think the challenge is really to design citizenship education programs in such a way that that we emphasize these things more. And that's also something that we're researching on a comparative basis. The problem that we're seeing is that a lot of things look good on paper, but then when it comes to actually implementing these things in the classroom, and I think Joshua is probably going to be able to say a lot about that as well, then it actually becomes tricky, because it's usually put into the curriculum in some form, but on the one hand, there's not enough teachers, there's not enough hours spent on these things. But then in reality, even with the best education, it seems to be the case that, well, theoretically, students now have media literacy skills, but when it comes to then going out and researching things, they just go back to TikTok, and that's a problem that we need to think about much, much more. Sorry for being so long.
Absolutely, no worries. So yeah, actually, you also brought it out, but Josh did talk about new media literacy methods. I'm wondering if we have any AI-specific literacy methods at all, and if Josh, if you know anything about their effectivity against AI media, maybe in cross-border examples, because as far as Europe, I don't think there is any example, but it may be that I'm not aware. So are there any specific literacy methods? Oh, yeah. Paula, sorry. I have a message, that Paula has tried to speak. Sorry, but let's
no, but
Josh
please,
first,
let's just first,
Yeah, I mean, I'll just be quick, and yeah, I mean, it's sort of an expansive field, I should say, and it does sort of touch down differently depending on national context or regional context. I mean, there are all kinds of protocols and practices, curriculum, out there, about how to engage with just this sort of recent wave of, say, emerging tech within a much longer tradition of just, sort of media literacy education. I mean, very quickly, for like the AI, kinds of examples on deepfakes. I mean, we're really at the point right now, maybe the sort of like late 2010s, there were, sort of tells for bad deepfakes of, eyes that weren't blinking and, skin that was a little too shiny. I mean, we're already at the point where, I mean, it's very difficult. It's perhaps even too much, to ask just like everyday people to be like scrutinizing, every image they see. And I mean, the images themselves in an age of generative AI are just getting so slick and polished and pristine that it's, it's very hard to just, to think of media literacy as that kind of, toolbox of close reading skills that we're going to be, each person a kind of forensic observer and interpreter of deep fakes. And so a lot of the say, like, trend and sort of interest in media literacy education within this sort of AI space, involves various forms of, say, contextualized, close reading, looking for labels and annotations and what's around the images that we're seeing and how we can cross-reference them, and trusting, going back to that word trust, in the venue or outlet or platform, really, we're sort of arriving at and looking to. And even more broadly than that, I mean, this is something I sort of spoke to, is that we're thinking about, questions of research skills and our understanding of the information landscape. There's just a lack of understanding of like how our images and our information sort of comes to us, right? I mean, things like within the, say, that, the US context in education and public education, I mean, media history and understanding of media power, of this sort of political economy of media. I mean, none of this is really taught, at all in terms of sort of broad-based public education. So, I mean, any sort of way of dealing, say, with a media literacy curriculum and how to implement that, I mean, has to be sort of thought of in complementary relation to how we think of sort of public education, more generally, and its potential. So I know there's some other comments, so I'll maybe just pause right there.
If I could maybe add to this, because what I find always very interesting is that whenever there's a new challenge, then we really focus on that new challenge. while the problem itself might actually be much larger. So I see a similar tendency now with responding to AI, where actually when we're worried about the impact of AI on democratic resilience, the problems that we encounter with shielding democracies and making them stronger are actually much broader. So I think that also in terms of developing these kinds of responses, we equally should try to have this very broad perspective. So of course, AI is one part of it. Knowing how, for example, journalism works is also a part that I think can be invested in much more. So just in general, how is news being made? But in fundamental sense, it is really about all of those aspects that are needed to strengthen democracies. So what do you actually know about how politics works? How are your interests represented? How do you get information? Who are the gatekeepers there? How can you as a citizen also participate in these processes and actually have a say? So when we look at the undermining of democratic stability, it is also really about the detachment between politics and citizens. So the lack of trust and the undermining of trust in institutions. So even if indeed, as was already mentioned, the scale of that we might question that, but at the same time, the trend I think is quite clear. So if that is the problem, then this is also what might make people more susceptible to manipulation. So either by inside actors or by outside actors. So when we try to respond to the use of AI in manipulation, then we should also pay attention to what might actually increase the susceptibility to these kinds of attempts. And that is a much more fundamental question, I would say.
Yeah, my comment was very much also in the same vein of kind of pushing back that media literacy might also be an individual solution to a social problem that we have. So the individual is made responsible for understanding what information and what truth is, whereas we should also have more social responses to it. And then again, like going even further out, I think the challenges that democracies face also have to do with the kind of politics that we've been doing. So, and that doesn't really necessarily have to have much to do with like the information environment, but also the kind of policies that have been implemented and the kind of erosion of social security networks and all of these kind of things. So I think media literacy is definitely part of the answer, but it cannot be all of it because we have bigger problems that cannot be tackled by one individual. Just having media literacy is kind of the plastic straw problem, right? I mean, it does have an impact if I stop using plastic straws, but it doesn't gonna solve climate change or So that was just my comment that we have to have more answers. And maybe also because research was mentioned, I think that is also where regulation is important because the DSA does strengthen the opportunities for researchers to access information on how very large online platforms and very large online social search engines are operating so that you can get better insights and how does information get to you. So I think regulation is part of the answer insofar as it helps strengthen research so far as that then informs education. So I think it's not an either or, as I think Josh, you kind of opened that up, right? It's a both.
Well, thank you so much. So we are always circling back to let's say media literacy, which also kind of encompasses AI literacy and digital literacy. And well, now we have access, for example, to internet, widely regarded as a human right. Do you think like multinational companies should be required to provide this kind of literacy, like for example, when it comes to media as well, alongside states? And like, should it be steered towards the direction of becoming a human right? I know it's a very broad and big question to answer, but I would love to hear your perspectives on that. And then there are a lot more questions actually, so if we can.
I can start. I think it was a really interesting question to really ask, like if multinational companies should require literacy training, digital literacy training. And I think insofar as we need to hold them accountable to the impacts that they have on society, yes, but I think there are much more important things that we need to hold them accountable for, as in like the way that they provide an infrastructure for discourse that takes place. And I think my first instinct wouldn't be to work towards getting them to provide literacy training, but to kind of be more transparent, to be less geared towards polarization. So these are this was my initial response when I first saw this question.
Yeah, and I can imagine that the literacy, the media literacy module that some of these platforms would provide would just be a kind of onboarding to to sort of make users more, amenable and interested and engaged with like their tools, I mean, it would have that kind of motivation rather than kind of like civics and a kind of, interrogating of maybe what you're going to see online and things like that.
Okay.
I'm going to be very brief. I mean, the idea of Elon Musk being responsible for human rights scares me.
Wow.
Absolutely. I fully concur with my co-panelist that of course, like the more that we want to place responsibility on these platforms, the more important it becomes whether they actually are functioning. And unfortunately, we see many examples of them not being responsible actors. So even though the DSA might now at least give the EU some tools to try and counter this, I do think we have to limit our expectations. So would they be able to actually fill that gap? It would be much more on a lower level, like disclosure. That is something that we can enforce, right? But at the same time, I would say that the most can be gained if we then look at the targeted advertisement that they're engaging in. Because especially advertisement, I think it's one of those key infrastructures that is very vulnerable to misuse, and especially when we're not able to differentiate between who actually is a political actor and who pretends not to be, but actually is a political actor. So even within like regulation of political advertisement, you have the separation. At the same time, in reality, you cannot always differentiate that clearly. So I would say that those are much more concrete avenues that would really take out some of those weaknesses that are currently embedded in these information infrastructures.
Okay, so I will pose one last question and feel free, any of you, to comment, and then we will move to the closing remarks. As we know, of course, technology is very fast-paced. AI-generated content from today to tomorrow can take a leap, and the level of complexity and sophistication could also change a lot. But usually we kind of lag behind when it comes to legislation and when it comes to also now media literacy strategies. And so there is this pacing problem that I'm sure you're all familiar with. How do you think we can keep up? And what strategies do you think we should take if you think we can actually keep up?
Well, I think the obvious answer is that we will never, but that is also because we're not supposed to. The issue with policymaking is that it is long-term. So on the one hand, we need to act on evidence. It takes time to gather evidence. And at the same time, sometimes we need to have more information to be able to really assess what the potential long-term impacts are, both of not intervening and intervening, and what kind of shape that should take. So I think in that sense, this is something we cannot really escape. But in terms of responding, what I think is very important and what we thankfully also see in a lot of European Union policymaking is to really involve all of those different stakeholders, and especially also like academia, civil society actors. So to broaden those discussions, and what that does is it allows us to flag potential issues much earlier on. I think especially academia, once we have proper research access to data, we can absolutely play that role in a much stronger sense. But also to then think about the creative ways of responding. So trying to break through some of the path dependencies that might be in some of the regulatory efforts that are ongoing right now. So I think that that's something to stress, and also why the securitization of a lot of these fields is so worrying, because securitization actually allows you to take shortcuts. So to not engage in these longer processes of actually going through all of the steps and engaging all of those different stakeholders, inviting a wider public into those discussions. So I think that for me, that would be a priority for how to handle these kinds of complicated changes in the future.
Yeah, I kind of want to push back that democracies are always slow, just because I feel like during COVID, they demonstrated like a remarkable agility and like keeping up with things that were happening and being kind of on top of it. And also the fact that we already do have an AI regulation in Europe, the AI Act, of course, is quite remarkable. If you consider that for digital platforms, it took us over a decade after they've been already well established. So I think in this sense, we have been quite quick. And the AI Act also uses some kind of like smaller tools to remain adaptable and agile to changes that will be happening. For example, a lot of the important stuff is spelled out in the annexes of the regulation, and it's much easier to change an annex in a regulation. And a lot of things are being clarified by technical standards, which can be updated much more quickly again than a whole regulation. So I think we also, yeah, as Mariëlle, I think we see a lot of innovation in European policymaking that makes sure that we can keep up to a certain extent. And we also do have a lot of, legislation in place that is not agile or like not dynamic at all, like the human rights, which remain relevant no matter the context. So I think we have some kind of stability that always applies to new technologies, even if they are moving incredibly fast.
Thank you both so much. So I kindly ask you all to give your final remarks. Maybe we can discuss in our final remarks what you think, where do you think European democracy stands at now with the wake of AI. And yeah, with that, we can move to Federica after your final remarks. Go ahead. Maybe Professor Conrad could start.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot. I think this was a fantastic discussion. I wish we had more time. And I really hope that we get a chance to meet again and continue on these very interesting points. I tend to kind of identify as an alarmist in these discussions, or at least it seems that way to me. I think democracy is in a really, really vulnerable place at the moment. We need to find good solutions. Again, I mean, I drew attention to this tension between regulation or actually, I guess, tension between regulation and freedom of speech. And also I drew attention to this notion of how do we respond in regulatory terms, or do we respond in terms of strengthening citizenship education? I think it has to be a combination of both. Quite obviously, we need to respond fast. I think we need to respond decisively. Well, how exactly that should work, I mean, that's of course a question that would require a longer discussion, but I do place a lot of hope in citizenship education.
Paula?
Yeah, I feel like I already kind of gave my closing remarks. I'm also like worried about the state of democracy, but I'm also optimistic about the steps that we have taken with regards to AI, as in the EU has taken those steps. With the AI Act being on top of that, with the Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence by the Council of the European Union, and also hearing that there are so many European Horizon projects that are also coming up with like concrete tools, that also makes me hopeful. But overall, I'm concerned but optimistic.
Okay, Mariëlle, and then Josh.
So unfortunately, I shared the camp that is very concerned, and of course, this also because I specialize in digital authoritarianism, and for the past 10 years or so, you see that these trends are becoming stronger, and they also have more and more transnational repercussions. So when you view the issues that we face within Europe within the global context, then actually I don't think there's much optimism. So I would be very concerned, and I think we should take very seriously the developments that we see in many member states within the European Union, and really be careful for those tipping points where a state might look very stable right now, but actually already be in quite vulnerable position. So I am very concerned, but do you think that the response or the solution would be in not trying to isolate too much one of these issues, but actually looking at them in their coherence, so within the social context, within the political context, and try to see if we can find solutions there.
Thank you. And then Josh, maybe I ask you to also give your perspective shortly on the US as well, since we have you here. So Josh, you're muted, sorry.
Right, I know, classic Zoom error. So yeah, I'm also nervous. I mean, just how nervous? I don't know. Ask me in about a week and 2 weeks or I guess just a week from now, and my anxiety might just be ramped up considerably. But yeah, I mean, I share in the kind of big picture mapping and thinking. I think that a lot of folks are talking about. I mean, we're thinking about infrastructure, we're thinking about ecology, media ecologies, and sort of thinking about the relationship across of institutions, both the kind of broad level, sort of macro level policy, and then the sort of granular, what does it mean for communities and classrooms and, individual citizens? And my thoughts sort of connect to that as well. I mean, I mentioned that, questions of digital media literacy are, ripe for reimagining and connecting it to a kind of, new frontier of kind of civics training and cultivating of sort of discerning citizens in that way. And certainly within the US context, public media is like ripe for reimagining as well. I mean, it's just been something that has been so deeply marginalized and underfunded and sort of under-theorized as a kind of network of institutions, and that involves bringing together, what were sort of traditional like public media, say news outlets or media outlets, with universities, with libraries, with civic organizations, and I think a lot of those local efforts, have really seen successes, and trying to sort of scale up from that is something I, take a lot of optimism in.
Thank you all so much. I would really love to appreciate you, because this was very useful and the panel discussion was really interesting. The keynote speech was very interesting. And I'm sure we all learned a lot. Thank you all so much, and definitely continue this discussion also on SOLARIS website. Subscribe so that you can maybe keep in touch with the news. And also, I would love to see this panel more and maybe discuss on these issues more. We're receiving a lot of claps and hearts on the chat, as you can see. So that's a good news. Maybe I will pass to Federica so that she can close the session with her final remarks.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. So, in a sense, it will be very easy to close this panel, because it has been already so rich, and anything that I would be able to say will not kind of be as deep and as insightful as you have been able to share with us on this day. Let me say only one thing, and I was very, very pleased to hear from all of you how we can spell out the complexity of these issues related to deep fakes, media, journalism, democracy. Because when the project, SOLARIS project, was funded and I was starting explaining what we wanted to do, I was often pushed into kind of a very simplistic narrative that because now we have generative AI and the deep fakes, it will be like the Third World War starting anytime soon, and really having a nuclear weapon just in the area of the media. And I always had really a hard time to explain that things are much more complex than this, and all your contributions today really showed that. I'm really happy that you put the emphasis on the process of handling news and media, that you put media literacy, AI literacy and digital literacy really on the spot, because this is also something that we will be doing in this project later on. I'm also very glad that many of you already showed interest in keeping contact with us, and it is clear that we will have a lot more to discuss about, and this is certainly not kind of the end of the journey. And I'm really glad to see that there is a kind of a choir that we are forming to explain why we need more voices, more disciplines to discuss these topics, and hopefully to inform policy for the better. In closing, really huge thanks to Yasmin for moderating the panel so well. Many thanks to Andreas for his keynote, and also to Alessio, who had to leave us for another commitment. To our panelists for making the time, staying with us the whole time, and for sharing all your knowledge and insights on these topics. Many, many thanks to Andrew McIntyre and Tommaso Tonello, who have been preparing this panel and this event for many, many months now, and to Ksenia Dimitrova and Gabriela Savova for all their support, not just today on the Zoom platform, but also for creating kind of the media infrastructure to make visibility, to give visibility to the event. Thanks to my SOLARIS colleagues for all their work so far. I wish you a very good day ahead, or an evening, or whatever kind of comes up next wherever you are. And I hope to see you soon on these channels. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.